Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Shooting for HDR. This is Kevin Shaw. I am John Hoare. Kevin has been a colourist for 30 years, working with HDR for 2 years. He's an instructor at the International Colourist Academy and co-founder of the Colourist Society International. I am a jobbing lighting cameraman, brand films, commercials, corporates, occasional drama. And Kevin and I hooked up through the cinematography mailing list when I was looking for help shooting some HDR tests. How important is HDR? It's as important as the introduction of high definition. What about 3D? It was nearly forgotten in 2 years. HDR is a markedly improved viewing experience requiring no bolt-on devices. It's here to stay. Everyone gets it straight away. Confusingly, HDR is two separate things. If you're shooting stills, you shoot lots of exposures at the same shot, you vary the exposure, and in Photoshop you merge your exposures. This is now known as HDR imaging or HDR, and we are not talking about this today. We are talking about HDR for moving pictures. Do I have I have a pointer. So on the top, SDR, this is what we've all been looking at for all of our lives. This is what we see. The human eye, broadly speaking, can see. We can see lots of colours, we can see lots of contrast, and it gets seriously, by the time we get to Rec 709 and what we see on our TV, there's much fewer colours, it's all squashed. HDR, different.
Awesome again at the end.
So I'm going to leave this on a loop. Yep. and James.
Hi. Hello. Hello.
Why did you make this film?
Okay, we met for a number of different reasons. One, it was a demo piece, and we were working with a range of vendors to deliver a piece. Secondly, and by the way, I'm not an editor. I'm the owner of Televisual. But secondly, at Television, I personally am totally wowed by HDR ever since I first saw it, which was Dolby Vision. Totally wowed by it for a number of different reasons. I was famously, anyone who's ever seen me on a stage with Sony will know that I famously disliked 3D from beginning to end. I didn't like the lenticular effect. I wasn't convinced. I was always quite public about it. The magazine didn't particularly champion it either. I think it has great applications, but not all of them. HDR, I think it's bigger than the switch to HD from SD to HD. I think it's a much bigger step change. What we're seeing by having the 10 stops plus of direct range, what we're actually starting to see is our eyes are interpolating into the image, and we're actually creating our own three-dimensionality from that image. There are occasions as content we shot, sadly one of the pieces which would illustrate it I can't play, where you actually project your own 3D dimensionality into the picture by having all of the colour accuracy and the more nuanced colour accuracy. You actually put more of your mental energy, your brain creates that illusion. It's super vivid and super lively. This piece here, really relevantly I think to your day, was shot on a multitude of cameras. It was shot on an Arri Mini, an Arri Amira, it was shot on a Sony f65, it was shot on a Red Epic weapon. It was shot on a whole range of cameras. The cameras have been capturing a colour space suitable for, if you're working in RAW, certainly if you're working in 444, importantly, suitable for HDR for quite some time. It's only the post-production process which has narrowed and limited those options ahead of a Rec 709 deliverable.
And what were the surprises? I mean, given that you've done your homework and you kind of knew what you were doing, were there any surprises for you as a producer in the process?
I think the surprise as a producer in the process, the biggest single surprise is what happens in post. I am going to give my very good friend Lewis, who's here from Atmos, who's worth a chat with, quick plug, because HDR monitoring is essential on set. You have to be able to see what you're doing. Plus, those little screens are perfect on set for any production because you get that much brighter colour and you can see it in very bright sunlight without having to put a coat over your head and get up close. It's quite a nice little product. Convergent have a similarly nice little product, but this is a very good product. So the big surprise was post-production. When you bring this in, we did another piece which unfortunately we can't see, shot on the Panasonic VariCam 35, AVC Intra 444, 25p. When we brought that in, that was 18 minutes of material. It was just shy of a terabyte worth of data. When we brought that into post, and the only meaningful workflow at the moment is with Avid in DNX HR, we bring that into post, the codec expands, and that 0.9 terabytes became closer to 2 terabytes once it was in the post-production workflow. Really key, the guy I was working with is an early 4K evangelist, Emmy-winning editor, a chap called Mike Saunders. He had a 12-core processor on his Mac, and it couldn't lift that data to work with.
Was this an HDR issue or a 4K issue?
It's a data issue. It's a data issue in terms of the sheer volume of data that you're working with.
Because it's HDR?
Because you're coming from the
Because
agency
it's
into a
4K.
444, then because you're then transposing it to do it properly, you're in DNX HR, which gives you the full bandwidth that you need to deliver the HDR at the back end. So we had to down convert that into proxies and then relink back in post. That again adds costs to your production. That's a really key point. Plus just the heavy lifting. You actually ideally want to be seeing it the whole way through the channel in HDR. You want HDR monitoring on set, and absolutely unequivocally you want HDR monitoring in grade. There is absolutely no point otherwise.
James,
ideally you want HDR monitoring in the edit process.
In any kind of wrap-up final thoughts in your last remaining 2 minutes?
Okay. Matter of factly, the televisions that are out there in the consumer market tend to flatten whatever you see on your OLED monitor or your Canon HDR monitor in grade quite dramatically. There are very few post houses at the moment, one I know of, which are putting an HDR TV next to the monitor. And the difference between the two pictures is marked, and the difference between televisions is marked, and will be for some time to come. It's a little bit like an HD ready situation on the TV front. We will get there, and when it does, when we have that critical mass, it will cascade and very quickly be much faster than 4K. And whether it's, and final thought, I think there's as much future for a 1080 HDR future as a 4K UHD premium future. And the reason
I'll
I say that is
explain
about
some of those terms in a moment.
Bandwidth.
Yep.
It's about bandwidth and delivery at the back end, legacy infrastructure with the broadcasters, getting that content out. And frankly, the differences between a 1080 HDR and a 4K picture, the 1080 HDR is significantly much better. And you all know, I'm sure, the arguments about a 4K TV and the optimum viewing distance. And that gentleman in the third row wouldn't know the difference if I had a TV this big in 4K against an HD one. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Jay. I'm sorry to cut you short.
No, not at all.
Can I have the slides back up, please? Converging beams. There's a DOP called Vanja Shanjul. I hope I got his name right. And I was able to talk to him. He shot several episodes for Netflix of Marco Polo. Thank you. Marco Polo. He also shot a special film for Panasonic to demo this particular TV model. And if we've got time at the end, I'll show it. But he's one of the DOPs that, in my experience, he's got the most experience in the world with HDR. So I'll be quoting from him a little bit. So today is about HDR for moving pictures. We are talking about more dynamic range, more saturated colours, and more subtlety of colours. And we need to talk about nits. Nits are how we measure screen brightness. Nits is also known as candela per meter squared, per square meter. This shows, this screen shows the brightness of Rec 709, which SDR, standard dynamic range, and it's that standard has a 100 nit peak, and it dates back to the capability of the cathode ray tube, but it was retained for HD. A reference monitor in a Rec 709 grade will be set to 100 nits brightness. Our modern laptops, phones, smartphones, between 200 and 400 nits. If you bought an Apple screen in last year, you probably got a 500 nit screen. There are a couple of standards for HDR TVs. One is LCD, one is OLED. OLED's better blacks, not so vivid whites, and not so high light. So the LCD goes up to 1000 nits. HDR Blu-ray DVDs are currently being mastered to peak at 1000 nits. 4000 nits Dolby Pulsar grading monitor. This is the best of the best grading monitors for HDR, specifically for HDR, and 10,000 nits is the theoretical maximum of HDR brightness as defined by the perceptual quantizer curve, PQ curve, which was developed by Dolby. And Dolby have been at the forefront for, been doing 10 years of research in brighter pictures, let's put it that way, for 10 years, and hats off to them for doing that. This is what we've spent our lives looking at. So if you imagine a scene, we're all familiar with squashing everything into the knee just below 100% on your viewfinder, your scope. HDR, now we're looking at this, which is kind of like as if you're shooting log. And in the future, clearly, when screens become brighter, then we'll be getting up to higher than 1,000 nits. So that was brightness. More saturated colours, that you're familiar with this. The outer curved line is what the human eye can see. Rec 709 is the smallest one. P3, the middle. Rec 2020, the outer. There isn't a monitor yet in existence that can display the full gamut of Rec 2020. Thirdly, more subtlety of colours. So 8-bit is, for example, Blu-ray DVDs are 8-bit, and we're going for up to 10-bit at minimum. Dolby Vision is 12-bit. Where are we in early 2017? Amazon Prime and Netflix streaming HDR shows last year. November, YouTube accepting HDR uploads. December, BBC streaming HDR clips, and lots of new HDR announcements at the CES trade show earlier this month. Where can we watch it? The full HDR specification allows for wide colour, space and 10,000 nit displays. No monitor currently exists. So as a first step towards this theoretical goal, the UHD Alliance consortium defines what standards a TV must meet to be allowed to be badged Ultra HD Premium. Members include lots of heavy hitters. An Ultra HD Premium must have 4K, however, as James was saying, HDR is in fact resolution independent. 10-bit colour, minimum of DCI-P3 colours, so approaching the solid black line, and a choice of LED or OLED for your brightness. And in cinemas, you can watch HDR in Dolby cinemas, except that I was corrected that I should be calling it Dolby Vision, not HDR. 50 in the USA, 5 in Europe, and except in the room you're sitting in, not yet in the UK. So the flavours of HDR for TV screens, these are display standards, not shooting standards. We won't dwell on them in detail as they don't actually affect how we shoot. Dolby, it's a proprietary system. If you are a TV manufacturer and you want Dolby Vision, you will have to pay a license to Dolby. It's 12-bit scene-by-scene metadata that tells the display what brightness and colour levels to use for each scene, or if you want to, every single frame. The second, HDR10, non-proprietary, 10-bit, static metadata, and it's also the standard used in Ultra HD Blu-ray. So static metadata means that you get one set of instructions for a whole film, not scene by scene, not as granular as Dolby's. And thirdly, hybrid log gamma, HLDG, developed by BBC and NHK, 10-bit, no metadata. It's a nightmare for if you are screening sports with multiple cameras and it's going out as a live transmission. To have metadata is apparently impossible. The BBC won't have to buy, they can use all their existing transmission pipe, production transmission pipe, except for obviously log capable cameras and HDR monitors at critical points along the production chain, and people, and you can stream it into people. So over the air, if you don't have an HDR TV, you can still watch that hybrid log gamma signal. You'll get a 709 experience. So in summary, it's fluid, still it's complicated. Lots of big players competing, collaborating. Good news for us, these are just deliverables. How they evolve has very little effect on how we shoot. Over to Kevin.
Nope.
Get my junk up.
Okay. So it's good to see you all here. So I'm going to reiterate a lot of the points that both John and James touched on. But first of all, there's a lot of myths out there. There's a lot of rumours being spread by people that haven't seen HDR at its best form, and it is possible to get it wrong. So sometimes those rumours are founded on something. As John said, we're not talking about the photographic version of HDR, of combining images. That's a process to get increased dynamic range on a standard sheet of paper or a standard screen. So we're not talking about that. There's no single standard yet, but that's not too much of a problem. There's basically only two routes to go down for post-production: the HLG route and the PQ route. So HDR10, Dolby Vision, and most of the others are all PQ. In terms of shooting, doesn't change anything, and really you just need to post-produce one master, and all the other versions of HDR come off of that one master. In fact, all the other versions of SDR come off that one master as well. So in many ways it simplifies the process. I've heard people saying, oh, I don't like HDR, it's too bright. It's not really about the brightness. The brightness is used quite sparingly, and we'll talk more about that later. It's not painful to look at. I mean, first of all, 1,000 nits is not a painful brightness. 4,000 nits could be painful, and I've had conversations with the BBC where they're talking about, well, we need to have a rule that says the average or the peak brightness shouldn't exceed certain levels and so on. But in practice, that's really unnecessary from my point of view, because as a colorist, why would I ever produce something that's painful or unpleasant to look at? You know, my goal is to get people to stay and watch it longer. So I think that's a self-governing problem. Is it tiring to watch? Actually, it's much less tiring to watch because it's much closer to real life. And so tired eyes and things like that, thing of the past. As James mentioned, it's not 4K dependent. It's getting banded with the UHD Premium as part of a 4K package, but absolutely not necessary. And we'll talk more about that later. And as John said, it's not going away. The reason is simple. The reason that we switched from CRTs to LCDs had nothing to do with LCDs being better. It had to do with the fact that we wanted laptops, and you can't put a CRT on a laptop. And the reason that HDR is not going away for any time soon is that the next big thing that we want to have, I mean, I was on the train this morning, terrible journey. Everybody's on their phones watching TV. And the problem with that is that in order to watch TV in broad daylight, you need a brighter screen. The technology is not there to help our industry. The technology is there because it's required by consumer electronics. And they're not going to make two standards. So it's not like stereoscopic. Not only is it more consumable, it's something that is going to be required by other industries, and therefore we will need to adopt it. And so we might as well embrace it. Things that are true about HDR. The only way to view HDR is to have an HDR display. Nothing else has to change. You can post-produce without HDR right up until the point that you grade it, and then you have to have it on a display. So that's really the only big change. The good news is that everything else doesn't require any new equipment. There are three main standards, but they can all come from one master. And in fact, I heard recently that some of the big studios are now only producing one HDR master. They're not doing 709 grades anymore. They're producing one HDR master and then tone mapping, which is a phrase. You know, the last 10 years we've heard a lot about LUTs, lookup tables. Predict that the next 10 years we'll be talking about tone mapping. And from tone mapping we can get different brightness levels within HDR, and we can also get SDR back. You've got to have a minimum of 10 bits on the display, and really you need 12 bits in post-production, and we'll talk more about that. HDR displays are capable of displaying about 12 stops or more. And so what that means is, for the first time, we can actually see what the cameras are capturing, rather than trying to squash what's captured into a smaller dynamic range. That's a huge change for the colorists, I can tell you. HDR has so much contrast, so much dynamic range, that we can vary the black point and the white point. So creatively, there's a lot of things to get our teeth into. And as I say, it's resolution independent, and theoretically it's color gamut independent, so it doesn't require 20/20 either. You still get more colors, even if you were to go with a 709 gamut. But in actuality, there are no displays, or there's no interest in not using a wider color gamut than 709. So what is dynamic range? Dynamic range is defined as the difference between your deepest black and your brightest white. And for consumer electronics, the way that we calculate dynamic range is you take your brightest white and you divide it by your deepest black. And as John mentioned, we measure that in nits, or basically candle lights, if you like. It's funny how we do that. Power is measured in horsepower and light is measured in candles. So it's important to understand that dynamic range is affected both by brighter whites and by deeper blacks. And amongst the electronics industry, particularly with OLEDs, you saw there's two different specifications. So the reason that OLEDs only need to get to 500 nits brightness is because their blacks are significantly deeper than on the LED screens. And that gives them wide dynamic range, high dynamic range. You need to watch it though, because as you just saw in Dolby Cinema, you can get absolute black. You can get no light on the screen. And OLEDs can have zero black. Well, if you divide any brightness by zero, you have a contrast range of infinity. So it can be a little bit misleading sometimes to read just the contrast ratios. You kind of need to bear in mind whether that's coming from brighter whites or deeper blacks. So in terms of the numbers, a deeper black will give you a higher contrast ratio. In terms of impact visually, you need significantly brighter whites. And we're not talking about twice as bright, we're talking about 10 times as bright or more. So I would summarize the benefits of HDR. Better highlight detail, better shadow detail, more contrast, and remember contrast is perceived as sharpness, which is why HDR on an HD standard can often look better, even sharper than 4K. We have more colors, it's more lifelike, there's a sense of depth because the eye is actually doing dynamic ranging, which it does in real life, which it never has to do with standard television. It's relatively cheap because to do HDR, you only need to go to 10 bits. That's a data, James talked about data increases, but the increase overhead for HDR is only about 20 or 30%, whereas the increased data overhead for 4K is 400%. So it's much, much cheaper to post-produce HDR than it is to produce 4K. Of course, if you're going to do both, then you've got 400% and the 30% on top. And if you go beyond that, if you kind of start looking at high frame rates, one of the projects I'm going to show you is shot at 50 frames per second. So that's 4K at 50 frames, so that's 400% for the 4K, 200% for the frame rate, and then another 30% for high dynamic range. And if you throw stereo into the mix, you can double that again. So you can pretty quickly get into some very, very large numbers. But HDR itself is the single most effective improvement that we can make, and it doesn't carry a huge overhead. To illustrate that, these are the 6 points of improving image quality as the viewing experience. So more pixels, and currently we have standards all the way up to 8K. Higher frame rate, there's a very strong lobby for 100 and 122 frames per second. A lot of that based around the higher pixel counts. HDR, as John mentioned, going up to 10,000 nits. Bit depth up to 16 bits, actually going up to 16-bit floating point. Wide color gamut, And the ACES axis that I've put on there, ACES is a color gamut that includes everything that we can see. So I'll come back to that a little bit later. And then audio, you saw the Dolby Cinema demonstration. Atmos, also available in the home, is object-based surround. So let's map onto that the various viewing experiences. So this is about where we are at HD broadcasting today. So you can see we've got 1920 is the pixel count, stereo, and 100 nits. And if you replace that with UHD Premium, you can see that's an enormous improvement in the viewing experience. How do we compare that to cinema? So DCI theatrical, so conventional cinema, digital cinema at the moment, is on a par with the new UHD Premium format, except for brightness. And so once we introduce high dynamic range cinemas, such as the Dolby Cinema, then even that broadens out and we get more color gamut and more Atmos. And I've gone to Rec 2020 in the wide color gamut box there, because lasers are the only thing on the planet that can achieve anything close to Rec 2020. And that's a point that we need to come back to. So again, the improvements in theatrical experience also go beyond even the UHD Premium experience. That is the next step up in home entertainment. If you were to look at the entire outer hexagon there, what you have is ACES. How many people are familiar with ACES? Not very many. Okay. Bit scary. So ACES stands for the Academy Color Encoding System, and it's been around for about 15 years, the last 2 or 3 in production, and prior to that in development. It's open source, so it's the Academy and Sony, all the color correction manufacturers, all the camera manufacturers, the display manufacturers, and so on. So it's open source, it's not proprietary. That alone makes it quite interesting. It's a color space. It's actually everything that's visible to human beings. It's a file format. It's an EXR file format. So it's a 16-bit floating point format that was first developed for computer graphics and animation. And it's an entire workflow. And the thing about it that's interesting as a workflow is that it doesn't limit your material to the display until right at the end of the process. And so what we're trying to do is keep everything at its native resolution, the resolution of the camera or the resolution of the film, all the way through the process. So we don't have to do this rather ridiculous thing of remastering content every 5 years or condemning it to a previous viewing standard. This triangle, again, if I can get a cursor up here, this black line here is the familiar CIE horseshoe, everything that you can see. And so you might say, well, why not use the CIE as your color space? CIE has a rather strange mathematical way of being described using XYZ numbers. In other words, it just gives you an axis across the bottom and across the top. The red triangle is the ACES color space. So it's a hypothetical RGB color space that includes everything in that horseshoe. And the point about making it an RGB color space is, again, all of our existing equipment will work with those numbers. So existing color grading, existing editing can all work with ACES file formats. Talking about scene referred, and going back to John's slide earlier on about the difference between SDR production and HDR production. So in SDR production, you can see quite early on in post-production and all the way through, we're continually trying to downsize the image to get it to the display format. And as I say, the problem with that is it doesn't last very long. And it's quite expensive to go back then. So if you have an SD master and you then need an HD master, that's quite expensive because you've got to go back and make it again. Whereas if you worked in ACES and you did everything at the capture resolution, And then right at the end you said, right, now let's convert it to SD or SDR. Then at some point in the future, when you need an HDR or an HD or a 4K or a UHD Premium or an 8K or whatever it is, you've still got that in your master file format. You couldn't really see it or monitor it anywhere, but there is a way to work in that way and preserve everything. And that's ACES. ACES is not the only workflow that does this. So Filmlight, Colorfront, Blackmagic, they all have similar technologies, but they're all proprietary. But they do a similar sort of thing. And the idea is that you take your camera, you convert it to a color space that is bigger than the camera. Ideally, a color space that is everything that you can see. And you do all of your post-production, visual effects, everything is done in that. You don't have to do your editing in that color space, because you can edit and then reconform at the grading stage to bring back the full resolution files. And then right at the end, when you've got it all finished in that space, you then, in the ACES parlance, you use an output device transform. A device transform is a little bit like a LUT, but instead of a lookup table, it's a calculation, so it's more accurate. And then you use that calculation to convert to HDR or SDR or 709 or HD or whatever it is that you need. So where's the HDR content going to come from? I would say that the limitation, and I bet that one of the reasons why only a few of you in the room have HDR televisions is related to content. If there isn't much content out there, there's not a burning need to go and buy an HDR TV. So where's this HDR content going to come from? Obviously anything that's shot on modern cameras is effectively shot for HDR. I was talking to somebody earlier, said, well, we're not shooting HDR yet. But actually you've been shooting HDR forever. Film is HDR. Film has more than enough range to capture it. But all the new cameras are already capturing HDR. It's just a matter of how do you post-produce it. And as James said earlier, the only way to post-produce it for HDR is to see it on an HDR monitor. That's the only way. This is just a look at, this is just off the internet, it's just a look of the claimed dynamic range of cameras, and you can see everything in that first column is 12 stops or more. Everything in the second column you could probably get away with. And the third problem, the third column is going to be cameras that probably aren't going to quite, they're going to show their limitations in an HDR grade. The second place that we can get HDR content is we can remaster. In the same way that to get HD from SD we have to go back to the original source material and remaster it, we can do the same for HDR. We can go back to film, and this is, I'm currently working on a restoration of Bugsy Malone. It's the 40th anniversary, 40-year-old negative we've gone back to, and over at Final Frame we're doing a complete restoration, both the color grading, dust and dirt removal, damage removal, and so on. Alan Parker's involved, so he's involved in the creative decisions. So another argument against this is, well, I don't want my material mastered to HDR. That's not the creative content. That's not the creative intent. Now I'm going to show you with Bugsy. So Bugsy is being remastered in an ACES workflow, and so just for fun one day we said, well, what would it look like on an HDR monitor? So this was actually using the DCI grade in ACES. So remember, I'm grading it for a display, a current projection display, but I've kept all of the initial source material. And I switched it over to the high dynamic range display. We have a Sony X300 at Final Frame, and I was blown away because it's the same image but with high dynamic range. And then the third source is computer animation. For years, computer animation has always been high dynamic range and then tone mapped back to get a more realistic experience on the screen. These are the available monitors. The two big ones, the Pulsar is the 4000 nit Dolby monitor, not commercially available, but there is a huge difference in grading something at 4000 nits to grading something at 1000 nits. For grading you absolutely have to go to 1000 nits, but even then there are things that you miss, and I'll talk more about that later. I just want to make this point. This is really important. imagine that you're all cameraman, right? So imagine that we are working to the zone system, and we have 11 steps from 0, which is no detail in the blacks, to white, which is no detail in the whites at zone 10. HDR is not about simply turning up the brightness. One of the strange things about what we do at the moment is, until recently, our 709 television spec didn't even define the gamma, let alone the brightness. And so televisions that we look at these programs on could vary from 50, 60 nits all the way up to 200 or 300 nits, but we don't change the grade. So what we know is that gamma works quite nicely across a range of brightnesses, but up to a maximum point, and that maximum is only 200 or 300 nits. Once you go beyond that, brightness starts to fall apart, and the image starts to look rather unpleasantly stretched, which is what I'm showing here. So that's not HDR. HDR is actually introducing more zones to the system. That's what really makes it exciting. And John's slide earlier kind of showed you how that maps things like firelight and lights and things into it. And we're going to see that by example. So in the past, when we're grading for gamma, and it doesn't matter whether it's cinema or domestic use, we're grading for gamma. It's 2.4, it's 2.6, it may even be 2.2. But in that process, we simply say black is at 0, white is at 1023. And then it gets displayed on a range of screens that could go anywhere from 80 nits to several hundred nits. It doesn't matter, it all looks fine. But once you put that signal on 1000 nits, it doesn't look fine anymore. The brightness starts to really get messed up. Now you could switch to log. So if you're on set and you have, say, a Sony camera, you're shooting S-Log3, and you're monitoring it on a something like the Sony X300, which has an S-Log setting, then the S-Log actually looks like normal contrast. It looks great. So we could you could say, well, log gives me high dynamic range. And in fact, Sony for live broadcast are advocating S-Log as a high dynamic range workflow. But the problem with log, as you know from watching log on a domestic television, is it looks pretty flat and ugly in the blacks. So you've got gamma that falls apart in the highlights, you've got log that falls apart in the blacks, you've got the BBC system where you combine those two to get the good part of gamma and the good part of log, and that's why it's called hybrid log gamma. That's how they get round it to get good HDR. Or you can do it the way that Dolby did it, which was to empirically test people's vision in the same way that the CIE tested color, and say, how much change do we have to make across a scale from 0 to 10,000 nits? How much change do we have to make for a just noticeable difference? And that scale is perceptual quantization. How much change do you have to use to make somebody see something different? And so empirically they created this perceptual quantization standard, and that's what the PQ standard is. That's how we are doing HDR. So in HDR, that scale from 0 to 1023 is no longer black to white. It's the brightness of your screen. And what that means is that if this is my image in DCI, where I'm using the whole range from 0 to 1023, when I put that on the Dolby Cinema projector, I'm only using, well, it says up to 100 nits, but I'm only using about half of the code values from 0 to 500. And if I wanted to do that for the Panasonic over there, then I would need to use this much of the range. I'm up to about 700 on my code values. Of course, I don't create two different masters. What I create is one master and the metadata that then maps it to the different screen brightnesses. And again, John talked about that earlier. That's the static metadata. You do it once for the whole program, or with Dolby Vision, you do it on a scene-by-scene basis. And you don't just measure peak values, you measure average values as well. On-set monitoring, the scopes haven't physically changed. So you can use the same scopes to get a guide for HDR as you do for gamma. What happens is the scale changes. Now on set, I don't think you need to worry too much about that because you're concerned with capturing information and getting it inside of your capture format, be it 10-bit, 12-bit, 16 bits, whatever it is. But in post-production, this becomes much more crucial. One other thing just to straighten out before I finish, we talk about Rec 2020 being the container for UHD Premium. Remember that it is just the container. No domestic televisions can do Rec 2020. What happens is they read 2020 values, but the gamut that they can reproduce is limited to P3. So we contain our color gamut to P3, and in fact the UHD Premium spec for domestic televisions is 90% or better of P3, so they're not even promising full P3 on the screens. That doesn't worry us in HDR, because in HDR these diagrams are chromaticity diagrams. They only show you saturation and hue, but that's only 2/3 of the story. In high dynamic range, the brightness is increased, and when you look at the true color gamut, brightness is a very important factor. So in this diagram, down here you have 100 nits, and this triangle is the 709 triangle. But imagine for a minute that we didn't go to Rec 2020, we didn't go to this bigger triangle. Imagine that you just have that 709 triangle, but instead of capping it at 100 nits, you could come all the way up to 10,000 nits, or even 1,000 nits. You can see that you've dramatically increased the range of colors that you can get to. And to put that into perspective, imagine fire or stained glass windows. Right? Within our RGB system, stained glass windows are a real problem. If you want them to be bright, you need the RGB values to approach maximum. Right? The way that you get the brightest white on a screen like the Panasonic is you send it 100% red, 100% green, 100% blue. And at that point where the RGB channels are all at maximum, you have the brightest white that you can get, but you have no color. Because to get color, you have to have a difference between the red, green, and blue channels. So in an HDR, whereas my white point here limits the various colors that we can reproduce, if my brightness reaches up to here, then I can take my reds and I can get them to 100 nits of brightness, just pure red. So you can get much purer colors because of the brightness of high dynamic range, nothing to do with the color gamut. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. I'm going to stop there. There's over the last few years, kind of working with high dynamic range, it's a totally new experience. It's a whole new thing. So whilst it's possible to say, oh well, yes, I can grade HDR. I put it on an HDR monitor and I just grade it and it looks fine. That's true. But there's a whole lot of games that we haven't really played with yet because there's not a big enough audience for them. Playing with darks and lights, color saturation, and so on. So the experience is going to be dramatic.
Okay. So, shooting for HDR. So the main takeaways for us, for people shooting it, shoot log or raw, shoot on a camera with a 10-bit or greater sensor, protect your highlights and shadows, know your camera's character, test it. RAW or codec. These are all very similar arguments to shooting the high end of SDR, but it's just slightly more important now. Shoot on a codec if you have to, but use as high bitrate as you can. Never ever shoot Rec 709. You've painted yourself into a corner. Minimum 10-bit, not just the codec, but the camera sensor too. So some cameras will give you 12-bit out on HDMI, but actually it's only off a 10-bit sensor, so make sure about that. 8-bit sensors, avoid them. So C300, for example, will show stepping. The usual suspects, wonderful for HDR, and of course not forgetting 35mm film, still the best. I'm sure anybody who's looked on the internet with Sony cameras, Alistair Chapman writing on the sensor for the FS7 II, FS5 and F5. Sony's always stated that this sensor is essentially a 709 sensor. The sensor in the F55 can capture a much greater colour range than the FS5 and FS7. Only the F55 can capture the full Rec 2020 colour space. I estimate the FS7 sensor can capture colour range closer to DCI P3, so larger than Rec 709, but not nearly as large as Rec 2020. So just to come back to this Ultra HD Premium, if you want to buy HDR TV, that's what you go for. These cameras will be adequate for that. But coming back to the title of our workshop, future proofing for HDR, maybe think twice about if it's got a shelf life, your program has a shelf life, maybe those aren't the cameras to go for. So just a quick aside, Sony are pushing S-Log3 as a live events intermediate production format. So they propose S-Log3 as going through the process, and then for example for live sports, using a 2/3 inch chip 4K camera, the HDC 4300, and then you can feed out whatever flavor you want on the bottom right. Alexa and a mirror. There was a bit of an issue last year when Netflix executives insisted that programs commissioned by them had a 4K sensor on it, and all the DOP said, "Oh, Alexa, please," and they said, "No, you can't use Alexa." So which is why Marco Polo used Reds and F55s. Kevin, you think that that's been rescinded?
Certainly, I know that Amazon will now accept Alexa. I'm not entirely sure about Netflix, but I think the penny dropped and they understood that resolution wasn't entirely down to the number of pixels on a sensor.
Yeah. So probably the most important slide in my presentation, watch your scopes. Don't clip the top, and don't keep your shadows, if you can, out of the noise floor. Waveforms, as Kevin said already, there are no special waveforms for HDR. Just expose as you normally do for log. I Skyped with Vanja, and I said, "What about LUTs?" And he said, "Well, the LUT that I use is basically testing the film, the sensor, the camera that I want to use, against some tests that Sekonic had devised. You take pictures, you feed those pictures with the camera that you're using. You overexpose, you underexpose, you feed it into the Sekonic software, and that produces charts, graphs showing you where you can safely expose. I'm sure other big brands do the same, but Sekonic, that's what he uses. He's recceing in Central Europe for a film called Marceau, about Marcel Marceau, kind of a road movie. Jeff Boyle, the founder of the Cinematography Mailing List, and Art Adams, DOP on the west coast of America. They're both sort of extensive writers on the internet. I would love to have them here in front of you, but we'll just have to use boring slides, I'm afraid. Use a light meter, expose as you normally would. If we shoot with cameras with a dynamic range capability of more than 12 stops, we don't have to worry about SDR, HDR, just expose in the middle. Monitoring. It's difficult because monitors that display HDR are bloody expensive, and secondly, you're highly unlikely to be able to view them in conditions that allow you to judge what is in the picture, unless you have the luxury of a DIT tent. For the moment, use a Rec 709 monitoring and use our experience to know what will work. So what about using a £1,500 monitor such as the one on the left? By the way, the box underneath the camera, the monitor, is the flight case, so think twice before putting that in your transporter. So it's not a proper broadcast monitor, however, 1000 nits, P3 colour, 4K, it's an HDR experience, good for art department makeup wardrobe, and reduces surprises for us in the grade. We're inexperienced at judging HDR exposure. Watch out for, against it, watch out for clipping. Domestic TV is beautiful, not necessarily accurate. Then this very nice little monitor, this is the Shogun Inferno, which is a recorder as well as a monitor, so you can record high bitrate ProRes on this.
That's not.
That's S-Log. If you enable PQ
Please come.
on the output.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Lewis from Atimus. What this monitor allows you to do is take the native log inputs from your camera and bypass the limits of 709. So you're really normalizing log, turning it back almost into linear. So it allows you to see up to 10 stops of dynamic range on the screen. So we're talking about, someone asked, is it going to replace log? The cameras will still acquire in their log format. They're acquiring what the camera can from a latitude perspective, and this shows you dynamically in the field how you can view what the camera is actually seeing. It's like an optical viewfinder. It's like looking down the lens of the camera and seeing 10 stops rather than displaying it in log and then adjusting that for 709 where we would bring that down within the limits. And what John was talking about on this waveform here is you can actually see the clipping point. So if we move all to the left, unfortunately it doesn't come out on that display over here, you can actually bring back the detail and the highlights. So even if you are using a standard dynamic range monitor, you know, it's really interesting to actually see how, as Kevin was talking about, your tone mapping down from, you know, the log into hybrid log gamma or PQ. So, you know, the main thing to come across with high dynamic range is shoot log. If you're shooting log, as Kevin said, you know, we're already acquiring that. You can take footage you shot previously, and if you had exposed it correctly and put middle grey as per way, you have acquired for high dynamic range. You've just never been able to see it. So you're actually unleashing the capabilities of your camera in the scene you created in a way that, as the diagram showed before, you're not having to trim and cut it down. So your user will get a much more accurate experience to what you shot. And this screen just allows you to see that on camera rather than, you know, rather than having to make those estimates and relying on the waveform. As John's saying, it gives you that feel and it gives you a bit of a window into what you can see in post. You know, it is an LED monitor, so it's not OLED, so it can't show the full range. We are almost bracketing up and down, but it's a better window than we have now until you get into a post-production suite where you're going to be able to see that full range. And, you know, really the BVM X300 is the gold standard mark at the moment that everyone is going by. But I'd say you can pretty much get, you know, on your laptop, say you wanted to view that back or view your rushes back on a train or back from your shoot in high dynamic range, you're going to get a feel for more closely to what you're going to get out of it. Yeah.
That's what you said, James, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. It's the it's the review on location of something that's going to give you an approximation of what you might find in post.
LUTs, from the people I've talked to, LUTs for HDR are optional. At the high end, there are some very smart people listed here developing end-to-end workflows that involve on-set LUTs, generally for crew who have the luxury of DITs. You can download from Ari's website look files for on-set viewing as well as 3D LUTs for HDR post. And Vanya was telling me that he works with his colorist or DIT during prep to design LUTs, depending on the sensor he's using. Lighting. I'm sorry I haven't got lots of lovely lights to play with here. For the foreseeable future, even a 4 HDR film will probably be seen mostly in SDR. You make a beautiful HDR film, then it turns out it's the YouTube that gets the eyeballs. So you have to keep that in mind when you're shooting. There aren't big differences in lighting between SDR and HDR. But since colours will be seen in P3, more colours, more subtlety of colour and consistencies will be more apparent. We'll have to be more careful about colour accuracy, mixing tungsten with HDMI, with LED, with fluorescent tubes. If you use a colour meter, make sure that they understand LED lights. Using LEDs, use high TLCI LEDs, 95 and over. Stay away from old and cheap if you don't want green flash. And Alan Roberts publishes extensive LED test results on the Guild's website. If you're shooting beauty lighting, if skin quality is important, tungsten halogen always been the most flattering. The shortcomings in LED's representation of flesh is more apparent on wide gamut 10-bit TVs. In my experience, even when you're shooting with good LED lights. There's just a little bit of washout in skin tones. Just maybe a suggestion, if you're using an LED as a key light, if you can just put a tungsten next to it and just fire a bit of that in, it just might help, or perhaps maybe instead use it as a fill. Tungsten halogen, it just gives you a bit more there, which is part of your flesh tone. Vanya, mixing HMI and tungsten, I have to fight magenta in a way I didn't have to do in SDR. So stick a couple of meters of 8 1/4 green and minus green in the van. Protect your shadows. Surprisingly, you need to take more, not less, care of shadows and highlights in a HDR. It's not something you can say, well, I'm going to be compressing, that top quarter and that bottom quarter into one stop for the finished SDR show. That's all that is going to be stretched and revealed as is for HDR. Lighting a room, it's a dark room, just lift the shadows a little bit, kind of like in the old days, pre-flashing a film negative, just to lift the blacks off the floor. Kevin's going to talk more about this, the aesthetics of lights in shot. It's much more distracting in HDR. Changes the aesthetics of a frame. A bright beam of light in a dim interior in SDR, a sunbeam would be a stop or two brighter than flesh tones, with hopefully an elegant roll off to peak white, but in HDR that could be 4 or 5 stops brighter, dazzling, perhaps even disturbing. Vanya, I light for SDR, then in the final grade I take advantage of HDR, extending the highlights, etc. I've yet to work on a project I didn't have to worry about a SDR. If you light just for HDR, then SDR will look terrible. A little small detour. Hey, couldn't I do this at home with my laptop? Shoot, easy. Get a good camera, editing easy, SDR in the usual way. Grading hard. So an HDR monitor is a necessity, not an option. Reference monitors start at 24 grand. The Sony 300 monitor is about 30 grand. Recent Apple screens, you've got your P3 color space, but only 500 nits. Domestic HDR TV. Yes, you maybe use that at home, but then you need to take it for the proper grade. You need to calibrate your monitors properly. Premiere CC and Final Cut, they can import, edit and export HDR media, but they do not yet, as of December 16, support monitor and grading compression. Avid say now support high dynamic range workflows, enabling you to edit and grade project and new color specs. Do you have anything to? I
would add to that, which is almost every single post-production environment where you go into, where you've got any crossfades or any complications whatsoever with your edit, you can only really come in on an Avid workflow in a meaningful way. If you go into a post-production company coming on Final Cut or Premiere, they'll have to restitch that whole sequence together for you and ask you. You won't have any ability with the handles. There's so much you won't be able to do. Currently, plug for Avid here, but it's true. Currently, that DNX HR workflow is the workflow to deliver an HDR deliverable. Kevin, would you?
Yeah, I mean, the only way around it is if you don't post for HDR. If you post for SDR, and then you do an HDR conversion in the grade. Mm-hmm. But then, as you say, you don't really get the advantages of shooting HDR that way, because you can't see where it works and where it doesn't work.
So currently Avid have something special. Hey, about time for them.
DaVinci Resolve Lite, the free Resolve, does not allow for HDR scopes, extended grading controls when HDR mode is enabled. Check for dongles on eBay. $495 US was what I saw a couple of days ago. Conclusion: finishes a proper grading suite.
Thank you.
With a proper colorist.
Absolutely. I didn't say that.
YouTube, they've started accepting HDR uploads. These are the main standout criteria. Must have HDR metadata. Get that with DaVinci Resolve, the full version. You can use, if you don't have that, you can use the HDR metadata tool, which you do have to know something about coding to do that. It looked pretty heavy to me. Tips from a few people. Nick Noland, BSc, the point she made to me was much more detail on the highlights. Okay, great. But often we want to hide stuff in the highlights, blow out a window in a studio set. You better make sure you fake that convincingly. Once you have brighter highlights, you have to treat your mid-tones differently and your shadows differently. Once you start adding highlights, the whole composition changes. It's a new language. Give yourself something in the frame to play with, just for that extra HDR zing. But be careful. You put too much in and you put it in the wrong place and your composition collapses. And Kevin's going to talk more about if you fill your screen with a fiery explosion for 15 seconds, then your monitor will start to collapse and your electricity bill is going to go up. I talked to Manuel Billiter. Again, he's been shooting for Netflix, specifically commissioned for HDR. He was shooting on a red Epic and then subsequently a red Weapon, where the blacks were a bit deeper. He was working quickly. He explained that to me, that they had to get through a lot. No one set DIT. I didn't do custom LUTs, but stuck to the fairly aggressive Rec 709 LUT, shot on the Red Dragon, and then I'd send frame grabs to the daily colorist just to check that he was on track. He said 1,000 nits is a desirable, 700 to 800 nits is enough. More than that and you get eye strain and your eye's iris clamps the aperture down. It's distracting. At any given moment, our eyes can resolve 10 stops thereabouts. If you look at a monitor, look at a big screen, which has got 15 stops, then you clamp down, so you start to lose your blacks. Your eye stops down. Save your 3,000 nits for explosions, not for street lamps next to actors' faces. Jonathan Smiles, a UK daily specialist, Spectre, District 9, Thor. Red and Alexa are both fine, so is film. The point he wants to make was a little fill is needed to get the shadows above the sensor noise and also to avoid zero values as it causes VFX issues. Most shows don't look at HDR on set, so selects are generally seen by the DP in the near set daily setup. Finally, Jeff Boyle, renowned plain speaker. Lots of people will try and sell you all kinds of magic sources and solutions. Some work, some don't. Ultimately, you don't need them. This slide kind of belongs at the end, but I'll say it now. Thank you very much to Dolby for their generosity. Thank you to Atomos for lending me the monitor, Panasonic for lending us the TV, and for James for coming in from Televisual. And over to Kevin for Kevin Part 2.
So this last clip is, I think, super interesting, and I'm just going to talk about a few parts of it, and then I'll play it in silence, I think, on the Dolby screen. Again, I can't guarantee that it's absolutely as it should be, because it's difficult to get into this room. You can imagine a lot of people want to be in this room, and I really am grateful to Dolby for persevering with me and getting it to where we are. So this opening shot is a sun shot, and this is on the digital cinema, and you can see it kind of blows out. Now, all of the clips that I'm showing you have been tone mapped from high dynamic range back to standard dynamic range, which means in a lot of cases the standard dynamic range version would not look as good if it had never been seen on a high dynamic range monitor. And this is one of the cases in point. In the high dynamic range monitor, if I let that sun do what it does naturally, which is to just go to maximum white, it just looks wrong. That's not the way we would see it. You would never look at a bright sun. And so in high dynamic range, you don't want to be doing that. So in the grade, I had to soft clip that sun with a little bit of yellow to bring the level down. Remember one of John's quotes, it's, you don't want to fill the screen with bright lights, because people can't look at that, especially as we go beyond 1000 nits. And so in this case, aesthetically, I don't want you to see a bright sun. I want you to have the effect of the warmth, this yellow color. And so I've soft clipped it to bring it back down. Otherwise it would be unpleasant to look at. So suns, I don't think sunsets are a great thing to look at. Let's skip forward to this shot. So this is the DCI version. It's an establishing shot. It's quite important in the... This, by the way, is a 52-minute documentary that was made for Blu-ray HDR release. And there's a Dolby Vision version of it. This is a lens flare in standard dynamic range. And again, I could probably get it a little better than this, but basically the lens flare and the backlighting of the clouds, they've got nowhere to go. They've got nothing above zone 9. They're in zone 10, which means there is no detail there. So that's something that doesn't work in SDR, but works incredibly well when we see it in high dynamic range. This shot here is of particular interest. On a 4000 nit monitor, this is a 52-minute documentary. It wasn't shot specifically for HDR, it's just really well shot. But in the whole 52-minute documentary, I think there's only about 2 or 3 scenes that hit 4000 nits. And this is one of them. There is actually quite a lot of detail in that tail, but that backlight from the sun hits a very high, above 4000 nits, so it's clipped. It's at peak even on a 4000 nit display. So that's a very, very high dynamic range shot. The other area of interest, and you kind of see it in the next shot, is the effect of the light hitting the stones. So the effect of the light hitting the stones. And this was an interesting project for me because I didn't grade the SDR version. They did an SDR grade for DVD release, and then later they decided to do an HDR remaster of it. And we went back and reconformed the whole thing and went back again to the, it's all shot on red, so we went back to the R3D files. A lot of times in the SDR grading, the colorist forced a lot of yellow and oranges into the picture to give the effect of warmth. In the HDR version, I felt I really didn't need to do that because the contrast and the sunlight effect really did that for me, and so I got much more natural looking pictures. And a lot of times in the SDR grade, I found that the blacks and midtones, zones 2, 3, and 4, if you like, are lifted so that you can see content, because this is, after all, a very contrasty real-world situation. And in order to lift all of the shadow detail, then you get exactly this effect, that the stones basically clip out. And so in fact, the dynamic range of this shot in SDR is much less than the available 5 or 6 stops. So this is an interesting one to watch in the final piece. What's interesting in this is that in the camera he's really managed to get the full range of the camera exposed in such a way that it's got good shadow detail and good highlights. I would say, if anything, he's exposed in favor of the shadows, which is really, you know, going back to the zone system and Ansel Adams. That was exactly what he was advocating back in the 50s. You know, expose for the shadows and deal with the highlights in post. Now, normally in SDR, I normally tell people for digital shooting to do the opposite, like take care of the highlights, and the shadows will take care. Because digital cameras capture everything in the shadows, but if you haven't got those highlights, they run out. So you don't want to overdo the highlights, but it's quite important to bring the blacks out of the noise floor, because otherwise it has an SDR look about it. And I think that was the problem with the Ellie shoot, is that the black should have been quite a lot of clean detail, and it just looks noisy and clipped. So I think looking after the shadows is really important, and this guy, for whatever reason, did do that. So getting back to this is an interesting shot. This shows you color volume. So a lot of times in shoots you'll have these big skies, and at best the sky is quite blue, but in our RGB systems, even in P3 color space, which this is, if you want the sky to be bright, it can't be really blue. To make it brighter, you've got to add a little bit of green to it to get a sort of a cyany color to make the blue color lighter. Blue is a dark color. In the sort of the equation that gives you luminance, blue is only about 4 or 5% of luminance. And so you can't get a deep blue sky here unless you make the sky darker. And obviously that has implications, particularly in the elephant. So you should just be able to see the hide of the elephant. That elephant is just above black. It's zone 1 in the zone system. So you should be able to see that. But to do that, I've had to give up the sky. And there's a few shots in this where you'll see that the skies not only are less saturated, but there's actually a hue shift, because to get the brightness you have to add some green. And it's not something that I do in the grading, it's something that naturally happens if you want a brighter blue. So that's a good one to watch. This is an interesting one. So this is the effect of spectral highlights. Works fantastically well in HDR. SDR, not so much. That white, we know what that white burn on the side of his hide is. We know what that is, but it doesn't look like a reflection of the sun. It just looks like clipping in the camera. So that kind of spoils the illusion. Now, it will still be clipped in high dynamic range, but it will be at a level where we can see it as spectral highlights. And again, the back of the elephant should be just above black. This is a really important scene. So this scene naturally has very high dynamic range, and you can see that there's a little monkey over there on the stone, which is the kind of the point of interest here. But in order to bring the sky down to a point, you lose the inside of the tree. If I was to bring the tree up, then I lose the effect of this image. And this is one of the shots. There are 2 or 3 shots in here which I changed significantly after I worked on the 4000 nit monitor. And this is one of them, because what I did at 4000 nits is I put a shape over the sky to bring down the sky level. Because even with the tree trunk just above black, that sky goes very bright. And that becomes not only unpleasant to watch, but it becomes very distracting. Your attention is off to the right of the picture, and you don't even see the monkey. And in the SDR grade, even at 1000 nits, it was kind of okay. I was focusing on the monkey. At 4000 nits, it was like, well, I can't really look at that. I've got to put something over that sky to bring it down. And then just for fun, I went back to the 1000 nit version, and I thought, well, what does that look like at 1000 nits? And it's like, oh, that's a lot better. I wouldn't have thought of doing that, but that's a lot better. And so at 4000 nits, you start to see things, even at 1000 nits, you start to see things that you would otherwise let go. And so overall, your master is going to be much, much higher quality as a benefit from working in high dynamic range. So this is an interesting one to watch. Not only if I put shapes on it, but I couldn't bring up the tree enough without making the whole picture go quite muddy. Let's skip through. Okay, so this was another sort of quite illuminating, excuse the pun, illuminating experience grading this shot. Again, this actually has a white sky in it in the SDR grade, and even at 1000 nits, that was kind of okay. It's not a white sky; it's a grey sky, so it's quite a cloudy or an overcast sky. And in the SDR version, this is really just an establishing shot. Either side of it, there's a bird that sits on a rock and it flies off and things. And this is where we are. But then when I put it into high dynamic range, it actually became the more interesting shot. And again, what I've had to do is I've had to knock back the sky so that your focus is on the water. And then in the SDR grade, again, the reflections of sunlight on the water are all in zone 9 and zone 10. If I was to bring that water down, because it's there in the red, the information is there, so I could bring the water down, but look how black the rocks already are. So then the rocks become ridiculously dark, And actually, the reason it's in there is to establish this bird which is sitting on the rock and flies away. Well, as you bring the water level down, that bird just disappears into the rock. So that's not really the artistic intent of the shot. And again, there's a couple of shapes even on this that went into it. That reed down the bottom of the screen underneath the bird, that again is very, very high in terms of brightness values. I think that's pretty much all I need to say. There's a few things here. This shot, again, tone mapping. This is done in ACES and tone mapped back to SDR. In the SDR grade that I saw that was not done through ACES, they couldn't separate the sky from the bird, and so both the bird and the sky are on the edge of clipping. So again, scene referred rather than display referred. The beach scene, again, a number of shapes to make that work in HDR. Watch for the sky in this shot in the pier. So that sky is another one of these skies that changes color according to your color volume. And then I put this shot in partly because I quite like it. This shot should be the same in SDR and HDR. There is nothing in this shot that is high dynamic range. You don't have to, even though we're switching from a gamma curve to a PQ curve, you don't have to make everything high dynamic range. And that's one of the things in John's quotes. You know, the object is not to make everything high dynamic range. The object is to keep that in your back pocket for the visual experience and effect. And so I put this one in because this one is not high dynamic range. It doesn't need to be. It should be the same in both. These ones at the end, I'll just play this little sequence actually. So these ones are really hitting the maximum ranges of SDR. So you can see this one is clipped. This one has got kind of this red cast over it. Look what happens to the sun. You know, they're pretty shots. They're what I call chocolate box shots. The sun again. You know, how much can you get into an SDR image? So it'll be interesting to see how those translate into the brighter color volume. So the ACES workflow works well going from high to low.
Yeah.
Obviously, if you go from low to high, then you can't see what's happening because it's just clipped. So you can get away with it if you're really careful. But I would say no, you can't go backwards. You can't grade something on a 709 monitor and then switch ACES over to high dynamic range and it be perfect. It can be pretty close. The way that I did this, for example, was I graded it at 1000 nits and then looked at it on the scopes and adjusted it for 108 nits, which is what this projector is, and then brought it in here and as you see, I've trimmed it to make it right. But can you get away with not seeing it on the brightest display? I don't think so, no. Now, so 1000 nit monitor is pretty much what everybody has at home. Like the UHD premium standard is 1000 nits. So if you're working on the Canon or the Sony X300, that will give you exactly what people see at home. Probably a little bit better because the black lights are a little bit better. So that's fine. And the whole thing about metadata kind of goes away in the sense that if you've graded for 1000 nits and you're displaying 1000 nits, you don't need the metadata. But what happens to those? I mean, I've got an LG, but it's not an OLED. It's about 500 or 600 nits. So that's going to just show clipping. So the difference between the gamma way of working is that you put it on a brighter or a darker monitor and you still see it the way it's graded, it's just brighter or darker. With the PQ curve, we're talking about such a magnitude of more brightness that doesn't work. And so what you have to do is you have to adjust the signal for the display. Yes.
So am I right in thinking there's kind of established like transforms like in the ACES workflow? So if you're outputting to a 500 nit, you'd have like a curve to do that. And that, like,
yes.
I guess my question is like, do you tweak that to taste, or is that something that's standard? And
so within ACES, you're correct. There are standard dynamic range cinema and high dynamic range standard output transforms. And the PQ output transforms and indeed HLG output transforms are for different levels, so 1,000, 4,000, 600 and so on. Unfortunately there isn't one for this projector because there's not so many of these, although there will be. So yes, those are standard ones. But then if you're using Resolve, for example, then within Resolve they have their own, I think they call it DaVinci color management, yeah. And so they have their own set of transforms. Filmlight have their own set of transforms. Colorfront have their own set of transforms. But it's all about, I think the important thing is, I recommend ACES because it's open source and it's easy to go from one facility to another. But the important thing is you've got to have a color managed workflow. Without that, you can't get from one space to another. So look how different these shots are. These are how they were in camera. The DCI version cannot show you what the camera actually captured, but this is what the camera captured. Actually grading this is much easier in HDR than it is in SDR. I didn't have to do anything to it. It's just like, wow, what do I have to do? Nothing. I only have to step in if it starts to get distracting, or if the focal point is in any way lost. So that's a question people often say is, well, does it take longer to grade it in HDR? Actually not, because a lot of things need a lot less work. It's a bit like the old days of grading in the labs for film. You know, film timing was actually much easier than color grading in video, because the negative and the print, they went together without too much work. It was only where there was a problem that you had to step in.
So moving forward, how you know, a lot of the time we are not able to get into the grade, or a production won't have the money to do a grade. How quickly is HDR going to be implemented within a post-production system across the board, really, for TV and everything that's going on?
It's kind of outside of my hands, but I would say,
I mean, do you see it moving? Do you see it
I see it
progressing
moving
quite quickly?
rapidly. Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
So it's almost just like well, I mean, it's a general term, but it's almost like a firmware update that edit houses and post-production houses are going to have to put on, or?
Well, but like I say, the good news is that the only thing that they have to really invest in is a monitor. Everything else is the same. It's the same grading system. Editing, most of these projects are graded. I'll let the whole thing run. Most of these projects are edited SDR, and there's one of the unfortunate consequences of SDR is that most studios are still doing SDR first and then going back and doing the HDR as an afterthought. And you saw that Vanya even said that he's still shooting it as SDR, but keeping a mind open for how can I, pick this up a little bit in HDR. And the reason for that is that, well over 90% of the audiences are still standard dynamic range. But I heard recently that at least one studio is now only putting the HDR version on the shelf. They don't see any reason to keep or grade SDR. Those will all come tone map from the HDR version. In the same way that nobody puts SD on the shelf anymore. You would only keep an HD version, and going forwards you would probably only keep a 4K version, because you can get a very good HD and a very good SD version from the 4K master. And so it is with HDR. What's going to happen is people increasingly for long term are going to be keeping the HDR master, because they know they can get the SDR one, the 709 version, the DCI version from it. They don't need to keep multiple versions of it. So how quickly that happens, it's already happened with some of the big studios. How quickly it happens in television, I don't know. Television always tends to be the last adopter. But what will change is where the production company thinks they can sell it, onwards later on. They will want to have these versions available.
So, a quick question about the colour space side of this, because it feels like the displays are very quickly becoming capable of showing nice high range, nice high nit values, but the sort of 2020 colour space side is still something that we're not really able to. Like,
Right,
if we haven't got a display that supports that at the moment, do you think that's something that's going to happen fairly rapidly as well, or do you think
No.
that's going to?
No, because you've got to go to a laser to get to P3, and that's not going to happen in the home very quickly.
Right.
But the 2020 is just a container. But we are moving from 709 towards P3. So we're mastering P3, and then we're saving that as 2020, but we're not using any colors outside of P3.
Just one point on that. It's interesting that I was just playing with the FS7 Mark II, and that that's talking about 2020, and Alistair points out that it's a 709 chip, and actually when you go into that camera, you are going into the sensor level and you're just remapping the coordinates from 709 to 2020, but you're still acquiring a 709 gamma, but from within a 2020 coordinate. So you're kind of orientating it this way at a sensor level. So it's not acquiring anything more, it's just changing where some of the coordinates of colours are coming from. So we're still going to be working in that 709 P3, but as Kevin was talking about more, we're going to get, there's a lot more to have from that same small gamut. When 100 nits is RGB 100%, you're getting more of that. In the highlights you regain not only detail, but also that colour there, where it was blown out before. When we were looking at the lady's hair being blown out, we not only got the detail, but that came back, and you get more 3D colour depth within that. The Z depth that you had in stereoscopic comes from that more colour, so everything looks much more natural. We don't necessarily need 2020, because within there is pointers gamut, which is what actually the natural world reflects. So unless we're doing like super sci-fi craziness and bringing in a lot of different, actually working P3 is probably the safest bet where you can go to.
Yeah, I think it's like working on a 4000 nit monitor. In a 50-60 minute program, only a couple of scenes hit 4000 nits. If you have Rec 2020, even if you could display it, you would only use it very, very sparingly, because they're not natural colors.
You mentioned that you can get the SDR version, tone mapped version
Yes.
from the HDR version, so you only grade 1
Yes.
HDR version.
With metadata though, so you go back and do a trim pass on the 709 version, and that's the difference between HDR10 and Dolby Vision, is how comprehensive that trim pass is. So, but it is tone mapping. It's just a matter of how much of the detail you want to keep, or whether perhaps you lose a little bit of the highlight detail in order to get the rest of the content correct.
And is it more like a touch of a button, or is it much more complicated?
It's a grade, but instead of having pretty much unlimited tools, it's a grade that's limited to, at the moment, it's simply lift, gamma, gain, saturation. So it's quite a basic offset.
So once you've done the cut down, tone down version, then you would just tweak it.
Yeah.
And then.
Yeah,
call
and
that
then you
as
can
SDR
output it.
version.
Yeah.
Just on that, you mentioned before that it's easier to grade for HDR, and there's more problems to solve with the mapping to the lower amount of stops. Can you solve all those problems with like gamma gain saturation, or if you?
Well, no, you don't need to though, because what happens is, in the higher dynamic range, like those are problems you have to solve in HDR. So you end up putting shapes and secondaries, keys, whatever you have to do, solve them in HDR, and then the tone mapping works.
Right. Okay.
But very often what happens in SDR is you don't really see what the problem is, and you're kind of chasing your tail trying to figure out how can I make this picture look good. So actually the problems are solved in HDR, and then the tone mapping works really, really well.
And you've kind of got a mid-tier. If you go from a high nit value down to hybrid log gamma, you kind of get a mid-tier within there where you can get a picture that looks better than 709, but not as good as Dolby Vision. It's the best of both worlds in that middle there. So that's a.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. There's a large part of the image doesn't change between SDR and HDR. There's up to, I'd say, probably about zone 6. You really want those to stay the same. Otherwise, you don't get the benefit of those extra zones.
So what we have to be careful of when we're shooting for HDR is the treatment in the highlight and the shadow. That's what you're controlling.
Yeah, you really need to manage them in a way that before the colorist pretty much managed that because you expected them to get lost. Now you can't expect them to get lost, so you have to really be aware of what have you got captured, what have you shot.
Definitely the point you made about the noise floor on sensors, particularly in log. You know, people say yes, log 3 quite noisy. It just tends to be that they're exposing it for a more 709 aspect. So you do have to subtly light those shadows to avoid noise down there.
I was talking to Vanya about his prep for the shoot he's doing, and he's shooting on the Panasonic Vericam, and shooting. He loves the 5000 ISO range, but he rates it at 3200 just to lose a bit of the noise.
Yeah, I'd say that camera is really a clean sensor. The Vericam LT and 35, they're some of the cleanest sensors out there. And the further you go up the spectrum, you know, as Kevin was showing on there, you know, your reds and Aries, they're not particularly noisy. But when you're getting into your mid kind of tier FS7, FS5 kind of cameras, you are seeing more noise in there. So you do have to light accordingly. More expensive sensor, more forgiving. And you can use more of the shadow without having to light it, but those other cameras you do need to lift them a little bit.
James, can we put the house lights up, please?
One thing on lighting, for super high frame rate, so say you're doing a 2K 240, you've got to remember that there's less time for light to hit the sensor, so you're going to lose stops there. So if you want to do some super high frame rate HDR, you're going to have to chuck a ton more light on there because you definitely lose about 2 stops in that. So depending on what you're looking to achieve. But yeah.
Yes.
Do you have any experiences with producers who are paying for HDR coming in and going more brighter, punchy, like they used to do with Stereo 3D?
I personally don't have that experience, but certainly on the West Coast I've heard that, and they regret it later because people look at it and say, that's where it's not very nice to look at. That's where that comes from. It's producers saying, crank it up, I want my money's worth.
They come in and watch it for 3 minutes and then walk out.
Yeah. And we turn it down again.
It's like when you go into a shop and everything's on vivid. You know, they're trying to make the screens look a particular way, but actually when you get it at home, you're never going to have it in that vivid mode. You know, good for a short demo, but not good for.
Yeah.
I'm sure someone somewhere is watching a clock, and obviously on behalf of Clive North, many of you will know that arranged today but couldn't be here. I know he'll be thrilled with the presentation that we've had, and I think a round of applause for all the people that have contributed, including your own questions.